The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's episode of Challenge 2.0, we reviewed how the COVID-19 pandemic triggered increasing calls from some that the community of those with disabilities is a liability to society, that society can't afford to protect and assist them. Some have even suggested that they should be willing to die in order to save the economy. We continue our discussion this week with a nationally known speaker on disability issues who offers a perspective of the cost to society of not assisting that community to share their gifts and talents, and what resistance to such assistance suggests. This week, we welcome Alisas Hayes, who is an extraordinary speaker, a thought leader, a consultant, and I'm glad to say a friend as well. And we're going to be looking into this issue of the communities with disabilities, how it interfaces with COVID, what we need to know about it, and some attitudes we need to change. Alisas, thank you so much for joining us again this week.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Alisas, I know, and we've talked about it in the introduction, that you interface, that you talk and guide and lead both the communities of those with disabilities, but also the larger community in terms of what they need to know, what they need to do. And perhaps it might give us a good foundation to understand how you found yourself in this place, because I don't think your speaking career, your larger career, was oriented toward the issue of disabilities initially. Was it? What led to that change?
No, it wasn't. My company worked with over 30,000 kids a year, focused on building confidence and self-esteem in kids. And I always considered myself a kind, inclusive person. We had kids with disabilities who would show up to our programs, and we always did everything possible to have them engaged. But I never in a million years imagined that I would be one of those people. And in fact, I had said that the worst thing that could possibly ever happen to me would be to become disabled. I actually, embarrassingly to admit, I've actually said that. And that's a pretty common attitude. People think it's the worst possible thing that could happen to them, which plays into a lot of our societal attitudes around disabilities. I was in a horrific, massive highway crash in an ice storm in Oklahoma, where I had 2 employees' lives at stake, which was the priority, to make sure that they would be safe and protected. In the process of this enormous accident where my truck and trailer jackknifed on a 2-lane highway in ice, I was body slammed by a semi-truck when I was running, trying to get free to safety, and the driver had it in cruise control, never touched his brakes, and launched my body 90 feet onto a cable guardrail. 3.5 months inpatient, a medical Learjet flight from Wichita, 7 hospitals in 4 states spanning the continent, and a kidney transplant with my brother as the donor. None of that was what I expected, but now I use a wheelchair. I have a really adorable, awesome little service dog who helps with pain when I travel. I have to spend long days in my chair. I don't travel much anymore.
That boundary that we believe separates those that don't have disabilities and those that do is not a permanent one. It can easily be crossed by us at any time. But when we see someone who has a disability, it's not just that person, it's an entire family, a set of relationships. How did that impact your family at that point in coming to terms with that?
One of the first things that happened, my youngest daughter, Sarah, and I were at a grocery store. I was in my wheelchair. We were in the baking aisle. I don't know. I think I was looking for baking soda. And a random woman 2 aisles away saw me, made a beeline toward me, stood over me and said, "Oh my gosh, you are so inspiring." My daughter stood behind this woman going, and this lady, she laid hands on me without asking
Yeah.
and prayed over me. And while I'm a big fan of prayer of all kinds, I did not invite this woman to touch me, and nor did I need to be healed from, I'd already been healed actually, and was just using my wheelchair because it's easier, and it helps me get around. The view around disability that this is a brokenness that needs to be healed is actually part of the problem.
What is your attitude now in terms of what constitutes a disability and what the bigger disabilities are that people carry around with them?
Mm-hmm. The legal definition of a disability is that a disability is defined as something that significantly impacts one or more major life activities, or a person is regarded as having such a disability. Under the ADA, you
Hmm.
don't even actually have to have a disability. You just have to be thought of as having one to be protected under that. And there cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities such as PTSD, uh, physical disabilities, which obviously is what people usually think of,
Hmm.
wheelchairs, people who are blind, people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And there's roughly 40 million Americans living with disabilities, one or more disabilities.
Hmm. We started to talk about the impact on your family, and it obviously was a real game changer and attitudinal shift for them. Tell us a little bit more about how you came together and that this is affecting a larger portion than even just those that have an experience with the disability itself.
I'm really blessed to have an incredible family where everybody, just as my mom said, we circle the wagons and we take care of each other. And I'm grateful to have that modeled for me. I said how this woman came and prayed over me, and I did not invite her to touch me. It took 2 years to get my own family to stop pushing my wheelchair without asking me,
Hmm.
because there's this implicit bias that as if it's the polite thing to do to push someone's chair for them. It's not. It's not at all. And one of our earliest experiences, we went to one of my kids' high school graduation. As we went to the infield seating area where people with disabilities would sit, people with wheelchairs and walkers and that sort of thing, we were stopped by two people with orange vests. I've got 3 kids, so it was me, my husband, and 2 of our kids to go in and sit in this area, and one of our kids was off with the graduates. They looked at me and they said, "You can have one person." I said, "Excuse me, what? I can't sit with my whole family to watch my child graduate?" They said, "No, you can have one attendant."
Hmm.
Do I look like I need an attendant? What are you
Yeah.
talking? And they split up my family, sent 2 people up into the bleachers. I spent the entire graduation bawling my eyes
Yeah.
out as I was surrounded with rows of empty seats right behind me.
Yeah.
A year later, I had another child who graduated. By that point, I had studied the Americans with Disabilities Act. I've since become a certified ADA coordinator. And I told my family, I said, okay, what happened last year was illegal and wrong.
Hmm.
And so hopefully those policies have changed. If they haven't, just be prepared because mom's going to be an activist. And the whole family went, okay, we are all in. So we show up. The same scenario played out, except this time I said, no, actually, under a 2010 Department of Justice clarification of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the rule is 1+3 in contiguous
Hmm.
seating. And they said, well, the school district says whatever, blah, blah, blah. I said, don't care what the school district says. That doesn't supersede federal civil rights law. So come on, family, we're going. And I pushed my wheelchair, and I had people in orange vests standing over me, yelling at me, "You can't do that," threatening me. And when I went to go seat myself where I wanted to watch my child graduate, because at a
Hmm.
graduation, you know which side your kids
Right.
will be on, right?
Right.
They said, "No, you can't sit there. We have to park you." I'm I said,
Park you.
park me, right, like a piece of furniture. I said, I very dramatically, because I'm dramatic, set my brakes. I said, as they threatened me, and my manager's going to blah, blah, blah. I said, that's fine. They can talk to me right here. And people sitting around me thanked me because they had received the same treatment. I sat next to one just delightful grandmother whose family couldn't sit with her, and she was by herself. It affects everybody. And the problem is, and when I speak to people who manage events and organizations, when you create this kind of situation with a person with disabilities, they're going to tell everybody they know and every member of their family. And now everybody knows how not inclusive you are and how discriminatory you are.
That brings to mind the obvious question. That is, did you have a follow-up conversation with the officials at the school district that supposedly were behind all of this?
I did.
I thought you would.
Yes. Oh, yes. I had multiple conversations with the Department of Justice, had conversations with the school district, the people in charge of their diversity and inclusion and ADA compliance, because they're required to have an ADA coordinator on staff, but that doesn't mean that person is actually trained. An ADA coordinator organization can it just be other duties as prescribed. And I had a conversation with the woman who was actually in charge of overseeing all of those volunteers. She goes to my church, and so we had a gentle conversation. Not that the other conversations were gentle, but
that's an important element of society to not only accommodate as if it needs to be accommodated, but to bring into the picture and as full participants, is it not? Both in terms of a justice viewpoint, but also economically and politically.
This bias costs us heavily. A study that was published in 2018 provided some really eye-opening information. First of all, of those people with disabilities, people who are working age people with disabilities, the discretionary income of working age people with disabilities is more than the African American market segment and the Hispanic market segments combined. Their discretionary income is $21 billion. Companies who have hired people with disabilities, as part of the same study, companies who have, major companies, have seen increases in their income by 28% and their gross profits by 30%. And overall, it has been projected that our GDP could go up by $25 billion through increased employment of people with disabilities. That's part of what really drove my passion as a business person, as an entrepreneur. When I see numbers, I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. How is it that businesses and organizations are not seeing that this is not just the right thing to do for equity and social justice, and it is the legal thing to do to be in compliance, and preferably go beyond compliance, but it's just the smart thing to do.
I think one line of discussion was that we really don't need to worry about young people and sending them back to school or requiring them or asking them to wear masks, because they generally aren't as prone to developing serious reactions to that. I think there's some medical evidence to the contrary of that. But what is that line of suggestion and this emphasis of getting them back to school, regardless of what the consequences might be? What is the larger picture of that?
Well, there's two pieces that I see in that. First of all, the normative assumption that all young people are healthy, that they are not at risk, that they don't have disabilities or other issues that would put them at risk. People who are neurodiverse, often referred to as on the autism spectrum, people who are neurodiverse may have a much greater time under the stresses of COVID-19, wearing a mask and some of those things. None of those discussions are what we see in the broader public forum. There is
Mhm.
just this broad brush of, well, young people are safe, which is inaccurate. The
Mhm.
other half of that is that those young people are connected to less young people.
Mhm.
And those less young people may be at higher risk, but that's not factoring into the decision making. So I'm a little older now. My kids are college age, but if this had happened when they were in high school, then our choice becomes, so do we not send my kids to school,
Mhm.
or where they don't get an education at all, or do we essentially again take that attitude of the person with disabilities is disposable?
We should probably interject the question because there are people with different responses, and it's my understanding that there are some that are excused from needing to wear a mask because that would have a profound impact on them. And perhaps those of us that see people without a mask, there are some that obviously are not doing it for salutary reasons, but perhaps we need to stop and do a reality check as well. Could you give us a little bit of insight on that as to why people might not be wearing a mask and should not be wearing a mask?
Right. There's been a lot of, I don't know, a lot. There has been some discussions publicly about people who are deaf or hard of hearing and use lip reading as a form of
Mhm.
communication, which there are some really pretty simple solutions to that. And there are people who are neurodiverse, uh, autistic, for example, that may have dramatic emotional reactions to having something pressed up against their face and the claustrophobia of that. Now, I have multiple friends with asthma, with chronic pulmonary, obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, who have talked about that they don't have a problem wearing a mask, that they can breathe through the mask, even though there are a number of people who say that they can't. But there are some people with a significant breathing issue, often people who need to use a portable oxygen tank, for example, who
Mhm.
would have difficulty with the airflow through a mask.
We say are on an airplane, we're in a market, we see somebody without a mask, we're concerned about our health, we're concerned about others' health. What is a sensitive way of maybe inquiring or reacting to that?
I think the first thing to do is, as I often teach, the Elvis song "Stop, Look, and Listen,"
Mhm.
uh, is is to first stop, look, listen, and to see before jumping to a conclusion
Mhm.
about whether or not that person is not wearing a mask as a form of protest of some
Mhm.
kind, or whether just objectively by looking at them you think, I think perhaps there might be something else going on.
Mhm.
If you're a customer in a store or you're on an airplane, if you are a person who's at risk, or you know somebody or you're with somebody who's at risk, you can share that information as a way to try and raise empathy. It's not going to do any good
Mhm.
to argue or fight with someone if they're not responsive to an empathy request that, hey, I'm at high risk, would you please wear the mask? If they don't respond to that, then the best that you can do is extra social distancing.
Yeah.
If you work at a company or organization, like at a restaurant or a store where masks are required, and somebody tries to come in and not wear a mask, then one of the common statements that's been going around, people say that the ADA protects them from having to wear a mask, and that's
Mhm.
not accurate. The ADA requires that accommodations be made. If a person with a disability can't wear a mask, that accommodations be made. But delivering curbside service is considered an accommodation. A person doesn't have a right to enter an establishment without a mask on if it's required.
So expanding our view, Elisa, from the COVID pandemic specific issues to the larger sense, when you talk to different groups, as I know you do so often, What do you recommend? What do you ask them to do to ally themselves with the community of those with disabilities uh, as employees, as business owners, just as people, to essentially not only assist those communities, but assist all of us in functioning better?
hmm One of the things that I talk about is that representation matters. So when I
Hmm.
talk to people who have any kind of say over the public image of an organization, I talk about including people with disabilities in their public image, and to not do that in a tokenism way, but to build a relationship with people in the disability community, preferably. And when I say that, I should clarify, it's great to go volunteer at a nursing home. And
Hmm.
I've personally spent years volunteering in nursing homes and places like that. But if that's all you do to engage with people who have disabilities, then that simply perpetuates a stereotype that that's what disabilities are.
Hmm. We've talked about the American with Disabilities Act. Is that a work in progress? Are there elements that still are not either well observed or broadening that's needed for that?
Broadening is definitely needed for it. Unfortunately, like any civil rights law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed in 90, was modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's just that they never included people with disabilities at that time.
Hmm.
It has to be proven in the courts. This is why lawsuits happen. The current biggest area of growth is in internet and web communications.
Hmm.
There was a landmark case that the Supreme Court effectively made a decision by refusing to hear the case and remanding it back down to a lower court, where Domino's was sued for not having an accessible website for a blind man who wanted to order a pizza.
Hmm.
When the Americans with Disabilities Act was created in 1990, the internet didn't exist.
Any particular experiences or resources that you would turn people to get a better appreciation, a better understanding?
hmm If If people are in the Pacific Northwest, then the Northwest ADA Center, it would be their ADA Center. These are federally funded agencies that are around the country. There's a dozen of them. So you can find your local ADA center. They are incredibly eager to
Hmm.
talk to you. There are organizations here in the state. There's Disability Rights Washington, for example, and they're working a lot on the exactly what the name implies. Um, there are a number of disability organizations that are by specific disability. If for example, people with spinal cord injuries, which is the
Hmm.
largest number, uh, that people can go to. And but any of those resources, I would say that the Northwest ADA Center is really the best choice, because you can talk to somebody there and say, I would like to talk to somebody about whatever your
Hmm.
specific thing is, and they are connected to all of the resources and can direct you.
Now, we know you speak a great deal on this. When you go out and talk, because I suspect there are going to be people that'll be very interested in hearing more of what you have to say. When you go out and you talk to groups, uh, what is the number one takeaway point that you want them to leave with? And what is the biggest element of surprise that people express to you?
But the number one thing that I want people to take away is that disabilities and people with disabilities aren't frightening,
Hmm.
that they're exciting and fun. It's why I bring all my background as an entertainer to
Hmm.
uh, that they're intelligent and communicate well and have all sorts of options. I want people to realize that their engagement with people with disabilities of all different kinds, that there are a huge wide swath of fascinating options that they can engage with them. When I do my keynotes, if I'm speaking to a group for the first time, I intentionally don't get out of my wheelchair until I roll on stage in my wheelchair. They never see me out of that chair until, like a magic trick, I stand up out of that chair on stage. And I do that on purpose to immediately from the get-go cause people to question their assumptions.
Hmm.
They see a wheelchair, they think a paralyzed person, and that then goes down a whole narrative in their head about who this person is, what they can do, what they're capable of, what's happened to them, what their life is like.
Hmm.
And that's what we do. We meet people, and in a blink, we see them and we make all these judgments. So I want people to have the experience of being surprised at how wrong they are, because at that point, they're then ready to engage with a real person, not their idea of a person.
And that matter of questioning our assumptions and realizing those may be far more faulty than we could possibly suspect. Very important for this important topic we've been discussing, but certainly spreads well beyond that. Alisa, I thank you so much for joining us on this program. I hope all of you are walking away with some surprises, some new information and resources. Thank you for joining us for this week's Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll join us again next week. Alisa, thank you again so much.
Thank you.